Hi, everybody. This is Marc Lawrence along with Andy Iskoe from TheLogicalApproach.com, our good friend, legendary handicapper Jim Feist in Las Vegas, and our producer Greg DePalma from Prime Sports Network. And we're presenting our Against the Spread podcast Super Bowl edition live for anybody that's watching the show and would like to join in on the show. You can do so simply on our Playbook Experts YouTube channel. Simply click on the live button, which you probably are on right now, and hit the chat box. Drop us a message in the chat box, and we'll be glad to answer any questions or comments you might have on the show for this special edition Super Bowl Live podcast. It's being brought to you by our friends at uwager.lv, where I want to remind you that every Friday night you get minus 105 juice. That's minus 105 juice on all your football and weekend plays with free same day payouts. Check it out at uwager.lv or call them toll free at 1 800 UWager. And with that, let me welcome into the show Andy Iskoe, Jim Feist. Andy Iskoe is also the publisher of the Logical Approach Football Newsletter. And guys, I'm going to tell you something. We're going to hit a lot on the Logical Approach Football Newsletter this week because it is outstanding. It's war and peace in football version is what it actually is. If there's anything you need to know about the Super Bowl, it's inside Andy's Logical Approach Football Newsletter. He'll be sharing bits and tidbits with us from that particular newsletter. It's 18,000 words, guys. That's how jam-packed it is. It's really fantastic, okay? If you need to get a hold of Andy, you can reach him at the Logical Approach, Post Office Box 20405. That's in Las Vegas, Nevada, 89112. Or you can drop him a call. The number is 702-898-9802. Visit the website at thelogicalapproach.com. I also want to
Mark,
yeah,
before you continue, we may as well get it out of the way.
yeah.
Last year, I think on one of our podcasts, I don't think we were doing it live for the Super Bowl, but I did say if anyone wanted to receive a copy of it, a complimentary copy of it, to send me an email. And I've gotten a couple of requests already from people from last year that I'm going to be taking care of this afternoon. But rather than go through the regular mails and everything, or even the website because it's difficult to navigate, just send me a request at the email. Say you heard it on the Marc Lawrence podcast, and the email address logical7, the numeral 7, LOGICAL7 at cox.net, logical7 at cox.net. And we'll just reply to your request with an attachment of the
I'm
PDF
sure
file.
Andy will take care of you for doing just that. Also, I want to remind our listeners and our viewers to this live podcast to click on the like button down below. You'll find the like button down below, and it will help us become a subscriber to the Playbook Experts YouTube channel. We'll keep you in touch with everything it is that we do here involved with the Playbook Experts YouTube channel. And with that, I'm going to welcome in Jim Feist from Las Vegas, the legendary handicapper Jim Feist. Jim and I go back a long, long way. I mean, we were back in the business before the business was probably even officially underway, Jim. It's been that long. I'm thrilled having you on board with us here. And how was your week going, getting ready for this Super Bowl week? I know it's got to be hectic.
It's been hectic. I've had some personal issues with some friends that were ill. Andy and I, who live here, have some issues with the rain. We had a lot of rain, and but it's been interesting. I made up my mind right away how I was going to approach this Super Bowl, because not all Super Bowls are super profitable if you just look at the spread and the total. But right now, because of all the propositions that you can do and all the quarters and the halves and the second halves and all the in betting, there can be a lot of profit as well, but you have to manipulate around that. And I'll talk in the show here about some of that also. But it's been a good week, listening to a lot of podcasts, watched a lot of shows. I was invited to go down to Radio Row, but I declined. I've done a lot of them, and they're kind of chaotic. They're a lot of fun, but I declined to go this year.
But let
It's
me tell
just too
you,
far. It's just too far away. Usually, I have to fly to another city.
yeah, from where you live, it is for sure. You got to take a helicopter over there to get in there. I'm a big listener of the NFL channel on Sirius Channel 88. I listen to it religiously. I know all the hosts, the programs, and so forth and whatnot. And I have to say this: it's Super Bowl week. I'm tuned to the NFL.com channel 88 network all week long, and I couldn't make it all through the week. It was absolutely unbelievably horrible. And when I'm saying horrible, I'm talking from the standpoint that if you, Jim Feist, had made it to Radio Row and been brought on, you would have been one of the rare guys that would have been on that show that was not there promoting a product. Everybody who they brought on as a guest was promoting and pushing a product.
No kidding.
It was unbelievable and unbelievable. You couldn't, you had to sort through the weeds to listen to whatever content was being said. And I quit listening to it this particular week, but
Were they regular guests, Mark?
no, they weren't regular guests. They were walk on people. Kurt Warner pushing that.
Okay.
Former football players, Jake Plummer pushing mushrooms.
Really?
Seriously, it was unbelievable. It was really really hard to listen to because you like to glean it and you like to pick up some information, which you always do.
It would be nice
to that channel. You always do, and in fact, one nice piece of information I picked up, I'll share with you guys early on here right now, is the fact that until the San Francisco 49ers acquired Chris McCaffrey, Kyle Shanahan had a losing record in his NFL career. That's what he's meant to this football program. Now, I don't know if that means that Shanahan became a better coach or Kyle Shanahan made him a better coach, but it's just stuff like that that you pick up listening to Channel 88 on Sirius Radio. So I'm glad you didn't make it there, Jim. Whatever you would have had to say, people wouldn't have believed it because you weren't selling something, if you know what I'm saying.
Well, the problem is I'd have had to pick up a product to sell on the way.
Well, you're going to talk about all the beautiful things that your beautiful wife does, but that's another story for another day, okay?
By the way, this is not to slight Kyle Shanahan, who I think is certainly a brilliant offensive mind, but I would think that almost any coach who gets Christian McCaffrey on his team becomes a better coach simply for having him there.
I agree 100%, Andy. I don't know if they go from a loser to a winner, but that's just the case it happens to be.
Greatly.
Yeah, with San Francisco.
I think we learned, Mark, too, with the Belichick-Brady partnership that it's just not so black and white sometimes. Where and maybe it is, and maybe it's too black and white actually. Where you can have a great coach, but if you don't have the players, you can't win. And then if you have great players, but you don't have really a great head coach, you can't win big games. But if you have the combination, well, that's the ticket. And it's very rare that you get the combination. You get an Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes combination. And Andy Reid, everybody knows Andy Reid is a fine coach. He's a very good offensive coordinator. That's what he does. But nobody is going to remember Andy Reid as some genius head coach. There's just not. He just was very good at what he did and had a perfect timing situation in his coaching career where he was able to be smart enough to draft Patrick Mahomes and develop him into one of the greatest quarterbacks that we've ever seen. And there's a lot to say about that. But again, that's an important part to bring up because I think too many people want to, is Belichick better than Brady? Is Brady better? It's not. I think it's apples and oranges.
That's why you always have the argument or the debate about who should win Coach of the Year. Sometimes the coach with the best talent does what he's expected to do with that talent and gets a lot of votes for that. On the other hand, you take someone like DeMeco Ryans, first head coaching job, rookie quarterback, gets his team not only into the playoffs, but winning a playoff game. And normally the way that I think it's a tough decision, but I would like to go with the coach who not just does more with less, but does much more than most of the other teams have done with even less talent than those other teams have. So the coaching is important, coaching quarterback. And, with all due respect to Bill Belichick, and that's why I wouldn't be surprised if he comes back. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if Andy Reid, especially if he wins, although it might actually be more if he loses this game, because I think he would certainly want to come back to be the first coach to have an opportunity, or not to have an opportunity, but successfully win 3 Super Bowls in a row. But I would think that with what we've heard about Belichick wanting to beat Don Shula's all-time record for victories, which would probably take 2, maybe 3 seasons with a really good team, maybe why he might be thinking that Andy Reid might very well retire. That would be a perfect situation for Bill Belichick to take over not only a Super Bowl contender, but a 2 or 3-time Super Bowl winning team.
Well, sometimes things happen, guys, for reasons that they weren't meant to happen. And as we're talking about Andy Reid, and we'll be getting into Andy and Patrick Mahomes in just a little bit when we break down the value of coaches and quarterbacks in Super Bowl games. But I had shared this, I believe, in our Playbook Super Bowl Guide newsletter, or if not, in the Coffee Club, one place or another. But the way that the Kansas City Chiefs came about Patrick Mahomes was really, really rather bizarre. They had a scout who is now the general manager of the team, and he was scouting Texas Tech. He was scouting an offensive lineman, and he caught Patrick Mahomes while he was watching the offensive lineman, and his jaw just dropped. And Andy Reid said to him, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm looking at the next quarterback for the Kansas City Chiefs." That's who he was. Nobody, he wasn't even on the radar list. But Kansas City made the moves. They convinced Andy Reid to draft this quarterback. They moved up in the draft to do just that, and the rest is all history right now. We're talking about a generational quarterback in Patrick Mahomes and a scout who became a general manager.
And it's interesting that you can make the comparison, not just for Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes, but just taking a look at Tom Brady and draw the comparisons with Brock Purdy, considering how late in the draft that Brady was drafted. And really, he was drafted high, Mahomes, but not as high as a lot of people today would go back and say, well, he was obviously the best quarterback to come out of that draft class. And we're not talking 2-3 years. We're talking half a decade or so right now. And Brock Purdy there's already examples that you don't have to be a number 1 or number 2 pick overall to have an outstanding career. Now, of course, Purdy's very, very young. He's only in not even his second full season, but there are precedents for someone coming from basically out of nowhere and having outstanding careers. And Brady and Mahomes right now are perfect examples.
I think there have been 2 quarterbacks that made the Super Bowl that were never
game.
Drafted. I just would throw that note in there. I'm sorry, go ahead.
It is a team game. I mean, when you pick best player of the year, the offensive rookie, I mean, it's a team game. You got to have an offensive line. You got to have a good coach. You got to have receivers that can catch the ball. I mean, half the year, Mahomes had receivers that dropped more passes than caught more passes. So, I mean, it's to pick individuals out of situations like this is crazy. And as far as matching players up with coaches, it's a marriage. You got to have a good marriage between all of those people. And we can pick this game apart item by item, but it's not going to be one player that wins it. It's going to be a combination of players.
That's a good point, Jim. It will be a team effort by the team that wins the football game. There'll be not one dominant player in the game. With that, I'm going to bring in our producer of the show, Greg DePalma from Prime Sports Network. He does a fantastic job with all of our Against the Spread podcasts each and every week, our videos that he puts together for us. I'm going to ask Greg to anchor the show for us a little bit. I'm a little bit down under the weather here, losing my voice as we're talking. I want to save as much of it as I possibly can for later on in the show when we get into the nitty gritty. So, Greg, I'm going to turn it over to you, and if you can set up what will be our first segment on this live Super Bowl podcast.
All right. Since I have control, I decided we'd like to talk about the New York Jets. So,
no. Wait, let me reverse that. Greg suddenly left. I don't know what.
Are they in the game?
Yeah, even better for Mark. I would like to talk about my college
56 years of counting.
So, actually, before we get started, I want to remind everybody about the chat, and that's where you can make your comments and have any questions for our panel. Adam Lastman has already started chatting. So has Rick White. So Adam has already made a prediction that the 49ers will win by 3. And Rick White, Northern California guy, and he says go Niners. So we got two Niners viewers, or at least that's the way they're going in this game. And by the way, you guys going to have predictions on this game later, or are you saving those predictions for your members?
Well, for the people that are on the podcast here, exclusively for them, I'm going to have a pick. I don't know how Andy and Jim will feel, but
I'll do the same.
As an appreciation, I will share a pick as we close out the show in the podcast here. And one other quick note, I would be remiss I didn't mention that Victor King cannot join us on the show. He's under the weather. He's took a trip to the dentist, and it didn't come out well for Victor. And he's in a lot of pain right now as we're speaking. So hats off to Victor for the great job he did this year. He'll be back with us hopefully next week when we resume the Marc Lawrence Against the Spread podcast, when we get into the college and NBA basketball.
Not to make light of the subject, but maybe you should check into those Kurt Warner mushrooms, if you know what I mean.
What Victor's been going through for the past several months reminds me of that movie Splash. Did you ever see that movie Splash? the guy that was following and trying to make everybody believe that she was a mermaid. And by the end of the movie, he had crutches, and he had all sorts of things going on with his body because he had been beaten up and everything. And he goes, "What a week I'm having." Well, that's like Victor. He's like, "Man, what a year I'm having." So it's been really rough for Victor. And just like you were saying before off the air, Jim, we've talked about this before. The older you get, the more tragedy and unfortunate things happen where you get old and people pass away, and it's
yeah. You always think about what's going to happen to you when you get old, but a lot of times it's about your friends and relatives, and you don't think about that, but then it surrounds you. It's just the two people this week. It's unbelievable.
Yep. Okay, so Lamar Sims just chimed in. Niners will win. Bet on it. So that's 3 Niners already in the chat. We have 3 chat members and 3 already on the Niners. So let's talk about the dudes.
I'm guessing all the Chief fans are listening to Taylor Swift music.
Yeah, you would hope so. Good vibes. Let's talk about the do's and don'ts here as we start handicapping the Super Bowl. So I'm going to start with you, Jim. With all your years of experience covering Super Bowls, give us some do's and don'ts that you think are real important in this big matchup.
Well, first of all, I mean, I'm not going to try to be a killjoy here, but if this game were on a Sunday with 14 other games, very likely I wouldn't even bet the game, because there's lots of reasons you could make for either side to win it. So when you get right down to it, this is like New Year's Eve in sports betting. So everybody gets involved in it. It's exciting. I personally, in some Super Bowls, I like watching the commercials more than the game, because especially in the early years when there were all blowouts. You remember those days?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Now, recently, we've got some good matchups, and this should be a very good matchup. But picking the game, there's a few keys that I'm going to talk about why I picked the side, and I will give it out. Matter of fact, I did a video the other day standing out in the rain. I think you got it, Greg, and you might have posted it already. I actually did give out the side that I bet, and I'll do it again here on the show. But there are things that I have to, when you go down, there's a lot of data. Now, you can take data from the first 6 or 8 games of the year, and everything's going to look San Francisco all the way. They were hot, blowing everybody out, and then they ran into a game with Baltimore with Trent Williams out. And a couple games after that, when Trent Williams was out, and they didn't look so good. But they did miss a field goal in Cleveland. They should have won that game, but they missed the field goal, lost it. But in any case, when you look at the first half of the season, when Kansas City just had nothing going for them offensively, they didn't look so good. Now it's flipped around. We've seen some regression on one side, and we've seen some progress in the other side. But just as a nutshell to close off this little segment, the best roster on the field Sunday will be San Francisco.
I agree 100%, 100%, Greg, Jim. They are the more talented football team when you check all the boxes of the individuals. But maybe the key players at certain positions, they may not hold that edge. But I agree with you. I think San Francisco comes into this game as the more talented football team.
I was going to mention, and Jim sort of said it, it's just another football game. And the vast majority of recreational and professional bettors will be making their wagers and making their money in this game on the literally, I was going to say hundreds of props, but with what's available offshore and around the world, thousands of props in the game where you can find a lot of edges. Because remember, you as the bettor, as the handicapper, have plenty of time to go over each and every one of the props that you might show an interest in, whereas the lines makers, they can't spend 2 hours analyzing a single prop from all different angles. They have to put it up. I mean, they do some work and they base a lot on what they've priced that type of prop in the past. But it's kind of like the bookmaker's edge has always been the 11-10. The bettor's edge is always been their selectivity. They don't have to play everything out there. They don't have to play every game, every prop. So just remember, this is just one game, and there are many ways to attack this game. And especially in recent years with the advent of technology and mobile apps and everything, now you can even get involved in in-game wagering. There are many games where I will not have an opinion or a wager on before the game starts. I'll see how the game develops, and depending upon which way that game is going, it may present some opportunities to get in there in the middle of the first quarter or the start of the third quarter or something along those lines.
In the vein of what you just mentioned, Andy, I can go back for the longest time and remember the Super Bowl being just one game. So many people would get caught up in it because it was the game. People who didn't make a bet all year long or didn't even know how to make a bet all year long would jump into the water come Super Bowl game. I don't think it's that way quite today because of the advent of the legal sports books. There's a lot more people that are betting football games here today. So it's not that one isolated game to that minimal amount of crowd. So there's some people that maybe have some savvy or some experience from sports betting here. But again, I go right back to harken to what Jim said. I think it was a great point. If this game were a regular season game, how would you be playing the game? You don't want to play it any more than you would if it were a regular season football game. You're always first and foremost looking for value in a football game. If you don't find the value, you have to step back past the game. There's always another game coming up next, although we're at the end of the season right now. So you're better off passing it if you don't really feel in your heart you have value in the football game. Those are some of the do's and the don'ts that I have. Greg, I'm going to throw that question back at you before I turn it back to Andy.
As far as my do's and don'ts for the Super Bowl?
Yes.
As far as we can kind of go into, well, I will say this, and that is that, and we talk about this when we're handicapping games all season long, being consistent. And this is something that is interesting because if you just look at, like you guys were saying, this is one game. So if you look at it as one game as opposed to a long season that goes into the playoffs, and you handicap the season the same way and the playoffs the same way, well, that's what I would continue to do, is to handicap the Super Bowl the same way. I wouldn't all of a sudden look at this game and say, well, all right, now I'm going to just look at it completely different. I'm going to take a completely different point of view, and I'm going to pick this game just based on whoever. Because I think what happens, and correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but I think what happens in these Super Bowls more than any other game during the season, especially when it doesn't involve your own teams maybe, is that you tend to side a little bit more with your heart. And because I think it's really hard for the average bettor that is not doing it for a living to bet on a team that they don't want to see win the Super Bowl. So I don't know what you guys think about that, but I think that's something that I could see easily happening. And I was looking over the playoff handicapping, the best handicapping advice that I got out of this little old playbook magazine that you've seen there all season long on the screen. And I was going through some of these, and I was like, well, look, I mean, it's basically all here. This was in the newsletter. Awesome angle. NFL playoff guide. Play on any NFL home dog in a wild card round if they play with same season revenge. 2-0. Tampa Bay and Houston both won their games. Miami was just 1-5 straight up and against the spread versus playoff teams, with only one win against Dallas, who was 0-4 straight up and against the spread versus playoff teams on the road. Green Bay 4-0 straight up and against the spread, their last four versus Dallas, including one playoff game. I can go on and on, but the most important one I want to get to are the two trends in this game. Patrick Mahomes is now 10-4 straight up, 13-1 against the spread as a dog, including the Super Bowl last year and including the last 2 weeks. And Kansas City has now covered 12 straight as a road dog of 3 or more. Now, they're not in that spot, of course, yet at this point. While San Francisco ended their season at 0-7 against the spread in their last 7 as a home favorite, 0-2 the last 2 postseason games. So That would be my do or don't, would be the fact that stick with your trends. The trends go all the way through. Don't just make the Super Bowl look like a standalone game and act differently. And a lot of times that also happens because you got 2 weeks to think about it.
Very good. Andy, I'm going to throw this to you, but we're going to refer to, as we are going to commonly on the show here today, to your wonderful Logical Approach newsletter. And you had a segment in there called How These Teams Got Here. Can you elaborate just a little bit on that, on how these teams arrived at Super Bowl 58?
I will actually try to read it as though I'm not reading it, because it sounds a lot better that way. But it's really, when you take a look at it, first of all, to sort of set it up, either of these teams can win. There's a sense of finality for every playoff game, because for every playoff game, one team's season is over and the other team's season advances until you get to the Super Bowl, because it's final for both teams. The winner wins the Super Bowl trophy. The loser gets to play the what-if game. What did we do wrong? What can we do better? Now, both of these teams have faced true must-win games. A must-win game is basically, if you don't win it, your season's over. Now, it's not like what they call must-win games during the regular season, where they are important to win games, crucial games perhaps, but these are literally must-win games. Now, as a number 3 seed, Kansas City has already won 3 of those games, the wild card round and then the following 2 games on the road. San Francisco, as a number 1 seed, has only had to play 2, and they've won both of those games, and they did so coming from behind, which is a nice test that Kansas City really doesn't have to pass, because they've shown it in the past that they can play with the lead or play from behind. But as far as how they get here, San Francisco, as I mentioned, the number 1 seed in the NFC, to reach the Super Bowl, needed just 2 wins. Both were at home. Both required the 49ers to come from behind to defeat Green Bay and then to defeat Detroit. Both of those ended up being 3-point wins. And of course, as Greg pointed out, San Francisco did not cover in each game. They might have pushed in the second game if Detroit's final score down by 10 was a field goal rather than a touchdown. That would have made it 34-27 instead of 34-31, which is what it turned out to be. The failed to cover, as I mentioned, both of those games, and they were laying 10.5 to the Packers, 7.5 to the Lions. In that game, the 49ers trailed 24-7 at halftime, but eventually were covering the game with that 10-point lead late until Detroit got that score. And it's interesting to mention that it was Kansas City in the Super Bowl that they played, Super Bowl 54. They were down 20-10 in the fourth quarter. In fact, that's one of the selling points that Shanahan can do for his team, by the way, because he can basically say, hey, in that Super Bowl, you outplayed the Kansas City Chiefs for 55 minutes in that game. And it just took a little bit more of an effort. And of course, you were going against an outstanding quarterback to come from behind. Right. So that is a point that they can use to their benefit. And of course, and we can get it a little bit later. Remember, back in that game, it was Shanahan's second season as coach. Jimmy Garoppolo was the quarterback. Deebo Samuel was a rookie, and Christian McCaffrey was a member of the Carolina Panthers. So it's a little different situation today. As far as Kansas City, they were the number 3 seed in the AFC, and they needed to win 3 games to reach the Super Bowl. The wild card win was relatively easy, as they defeated Miami for a second time this season, 26-7. If you recall, they played in Germany in midseason, and that was a 21-14 win for the Chiefs. Then, of course, Mahomes had never played a true postseason road game. I say a true postseason road game because the game in Tampa Bay against the Buccaneers was in Tampa. So not technically a road game because it was a neutral site for the Super Bowl, but it was still a road game on a field that the Buccaneers had played all year. And, of course, the Buccaneers won that game. So this was a first true playoff road game that they played in Buffalo. They won that game as a small underdog. And then the following week they upset. And I sort of put upset in quotes because, when you are as good as Kansas City and you're on the road and you finally passed your first test by winning, that was an upset to the extent that it was an upset by the line. A lot of people liked Kansas City in that game, both plus the points and more to the point to the money line. And then they defeated Baltimore on the road 17-10. And I got a bad sense at the very start of that game for Baltimore. If you recall, in the pregame show, they showed a clip of Mahomes in the locker room rallying the team, screaming and everything, getting the team fired up. And then they showed, as the teams were about to enter the field, they showed the Baltimore Ravens stoically standing and they're about to exit the tunnel. Very bad body language. And I'm not taking anything away from Kansas City because they did win the game, but Baltimore may have lost it more than Kansas City won it. Although I will say, and we'll talk about it when you get to the props, because there's a couple of interesting props that the property who put it up could have been very creative and given the prop specific names for a couple of things that happened in that game. Instead, they just went with the straightforward words in that game. So, since the win in Buffalo was the first true road playoff game for Kansas City since a divisional round game at Houston back in 2015. So most of their, in fact, all of their postseason games up until this year, except for that game in Tampa Bay, which again, not a home game, of course, but all the other games were home games. These were the first true road games in nearly, in basically 8 seasons for the Kansas City Chiefs, and they passed both tests.
Interesting about that game, Andy, the last game against Baltimore. Baltimore was heavily bet by the biggest bettors that I know here and around the world. And they were all over Baltimore in that game, and they had the reasons. I didn't agree with them, but of course I respect them. So I had my bet on Kansas City, but it wasn't very long, wasn't strong because of them. Because you have to respect winning players, especially when they back it up with $300,000 to $1 million bets. So, but in any case, they were totally wrong. And Monken came out with a game plan that no one understands, because the way you're supposed to attack Kansas City is the running game, and Baltimore is a very good running team, but they didn't run. I mean, they ran the first play, got 23 yards, and then they backed off, and the rest of the game was like 45 passes and 16 runs, and only 3 other times did they use a back to run the ball. I don't know what they were doing, but Kansas City's defense has been superb, and that might be the key to this game, and we can talk about it later in our analysis. There's a difference. In the offseason, San Francisco lost their defensive coordinator, and he went down to Houston and became the head coach. His name is
DeMeco Ryans.
DeMeco Ryans, but Wilkes is now the San Francisco defensive coordinator. Well, Spagnuolo is and has been for a while the defensive coordinator for San Francisco, and their defense has been playing lights out. And that could be, I mean, I'm going to go into, I guess I should go into this. I'll just do it. If you were going to make a bet, let's play a game. If you were going to make, who's going to make a mistake between Mahomes and Purdy? Probably most people would say the mistake will come from Purdy. He's a second-year quarterback, never been in the Super Bowl. And I'm just going to answer my own question as I think most people would answer it. Who's going to make a mistake? Kyle Shanahan or Andy Reid?
We have a history on that one.
Yeah, I know, and it's pretty strong. Guys lost 2 fourth-quarter leads with Super Bowls, different teams, different coordinator and head coach. And Andy has won tons of things and been with not only one quarterback, but several.
And 6 straight AFC Championship game appearances.
That's
in that time.
That's
winning
right.
4 times.
And then who's going to make a mistake?
Now that's what everybody wants to know, Jim, because turnovers are going to be vital. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm going to go to the next thing: is Spagnuolo or Wilkes?
I think you got all of the numbers behind Spags in something like that for sure.
I'll mention something that I wrote in the newsletter. Go back to the Super Bowl between the unbeaten Patriots and the New York Giants. Okay, Spagnuolo was in his first year, I believe, as defensive coordinator of the Giants. They played in the final game, Week 17 of the 16-game schedule at that time of the season. Patriots won 38-35. That was the year, by the way, when the Patriots set 589 total points scored, which at the time was a record. It was beaten a few years later by the Denver Broncos with Peyton Manning. And their scoring differential that year for the Patriots, plus 315 points, still is the record for scoring for and against in a single season. So the Patriots got to 16-0 because they managed to hold off the Giants 38-35. They met about a month later. We all know what happened, but Eli Manning, the David Tyree pass and all that, and he got the Super Bowl MVP. Giants didn't win that game because of the offense. They held that high-scoring New England Patriots team down to 14 points. That's how impressive the effort was from Steve Spagnuolo. Now, he was the defensive coordinator with the Chiefs in their first Super Bowl. I think it was his first season with Kansas City as the defensive coordinator. Of course, he had previously coached the Rams, etc. In that interim time. But he comes into he actually played a decent game with Kansas City because they shut down San Francisco mostly in the second half. But he wasn't familiar with a lot of the personnel. So I place a lot of emphasis on Spagnuolo having. In fact, I'll just mention right now, one of the concerns I have for San Francisco is, will they be able to protect Purdy? Because if I'm Spagnuolo and if I'm the Kansas City defense, guys like Chris Jones, they're going to be in the backfield all game. And it's going to be San Francisco's ability to be prepared, but not just be prepared, be able to execute an offense that takes advantage of the pressure that the Kansas City will try to apply.
Hey guys, let me short circuit this. I think we hit that nail pretty well on the head about how they got here. And my final statement on that subject is real simple from the well-oiled machine. It's basically this, that teams who enter into the Super Bowl off a point spread loss in the championship game, this is going back to 1980, they're just 3-8 straight up and 2-8-1 against the spread. That's San Francisco wins and no covers. On the flip side, teams who go into the Super Bowl game off a straight up underdog win, they are 19-7-1 against the spread since 1980. So that's how they got here. These two football teams will draw a conclusion later on in the show.
Isn't there something also, Mark, because I know you have all this data, about the team with the better record during the season absolutely not doing well?
You don't want to have a better record, Jim. 1-15 against the spread. The last 16 teams that have had a better record in the Super Bowl.
Wow.
Yeah, so now that did not apply last year because Philadelphia and Kansas City had the same record. It does apply this year.
Exactly, but it does this year. And
by the way, I think it's 2-15, going back to like 2003. One of the two wins was when the Patriots rallied against the Atlanta Falcons, who the Patriots had the better record, but they were on the losing end. And I think you have to go all the way back to, I think it was the 2003 season when the Raiders played Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay won that with a weaker record than the Raiders, but even there's an asterisk because John Gruden had just been coaching the Raiders for four years or so before he went to Tampa Bay. So that was his first year with Tampa Bay, and he knew basically, and they admitted afterwards, that they basically knew every play the Raiders were going to run.
Yeah, there's some good and some ugly stats, obviously, that evolve around situations like that, especially pertaining in this particular football game. Greg,
by the way, I was just going to say, Kansas City was 11-6, San Francisco 12-5. So San Francisco does come in with a better record this year.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Speaking of stats, and I want to we'll use that to move on to the next segment. But before we do, I do have to jump into our chat because Jeff has a question. Is the experience factor Kansas City? Basically, I think what he's trying to say is the experience factor for Kansas City a plus? And if so, what's the point value?
Well, I think absolutely experience is a plus when it comes to handicapping big games, whether it's a Super Bowl or the NCAA tournament or World Series games. Experience matters a whole lot. And we check those boxes of experience. Again, the check box is here. Go to Kansas City, Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes over Kyle Shanahan and Brock Purdy. Now, doesn't mean that Brock Purdy isn't going to end up in his career having gained from being in this football game, pulls up, not pulls the upset, but wins this game, and all of a sudden it's the notch that he needed to get his career going. But coming into the game, I think experience means a whole lot. In fact, I think it's the number one vital statistic.
I was going to ask you, Mark, along those lines. San Francisco also has some pretty decent playoff experience. not nearly as much as success, although they have all those NFC Championship game appearances. I look at it as, yes, experience is very important, but I think it's not as significant of an edge as if they were going against a team that maybe had been in the playoffs maybe 1 year before this year, and they were still very limited. Kansas City right now has more experience than any team playing currently any of the 32 teams, but it's assigning a point value to it is hard to say, simply because, as I mentioned before, both of these teams, including the less experienced San Francisco team, already won 2 games and came very close to losing 2 games when their season was over. So, yeah, they are at a disadvantage, but at least they've passed a number of tests. So it's a question of how much, people put like 1 point of value or 2 points of value. I've always had a question with, or an issue with how many points you put on a specific proposition or situation. You don't score points in ones and twos in football like you do in basketball and other such sports. You scores in threes and sixes, and so maybe sometimes is it worth the difference between a field goal and a touchdown?
Let's talk about why the favorite are the Patriots, or not the
Niners.
The Niners. I don't think the Patriots are playing this week, but in the beginning of the year, August, July, and I'm one of these guys that made a pretty good bet on the Niners to win it all. Got a nice price. I'm still sitting with a ticket on the Niners to win it all. So, what do people do that have the Niners to win it all and they're starting to question their bet? They come in and the bookmakers have a lot of liability on the Niners winning it all. So what do they have to do? They got to put up a number that attracts some money on the other side. That's why I believe the Niners originated as the favorite in this game. And I say originated because I'm not too sure it won't go the other way, at least down to a pick 'em before kickoff.
It did last year with the Eagles and Chiefs.
That's right.
Eagles opened a small favorite, closed the point half dog.
The books have a tremendous liability on San Francisco winning this Super Bowl. So
Jim, that's a great point you brought out, and it's a question I'm asked often, or have been asked often, is why is San Francisco a favorite in a game like this? And my answer was, and I think I like your answer better, is that for the longest time all season long, when they did put out early Super Bowl lines, obviously they didn't know who was playing, but they based them on the conferences, the NFC against the AFC. And it was thought that the NFC was a stronger conference, so the NFC ended up being a 2 or 2.5 point favorite. Now, I don't know if they take enough money, Andy, in games like that to sway this particular line, but like Jim says, there's a lot of liability right now in San Francisco.
Yeah, I don't know how much they write, and I think that was also perhaps part of the justification, because that liability that Jim talks about has really existed all season. I'm not so sure that the NFC before the season was the stronger conference, especially when you take a look at who the main contenders were in the NFC. It was basically San Francisco, Philadelphia, and Dallas. In the AFC, you had Kansas City, you had Cincinnati, you had Buffalo. Some people thought that there were a couple of other teams that were highly up there, like maybe a Pittsburgh or even a Cleveland, based upon what they brought into the season. Detroit was a team on the rise, but I personally, if I were just going to do power ratings on this game, I would have actually had the game either pick 'em or Kansas City a 1 point favorite.
Well, it's like we mentioned before, Billy Walters was in Las Vegas and visited Radio Row and let it be known that he bet on Kansas City in this football game. And when asked why, he said he made Kansas City, I think, either a 2 or a 3 point favorite in the football game. So
said the line was 4 points off by his numbers.
By his numbers, exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Knuckles, this is, again, someone from the chat, P. Knuckles P. And I think he's referencing the San Francisco comeback. This game is the poster child for in-game betting. And that's really interesting, of course, because I had a bet on Detroit in the money line, and they had the big lead. And that's something that I think some average gamblers out there don't take enough advantage of, is realizing that if you have a bet like that, and now it's halftime, or you're in the second quarter, and it's a big number, especially if it's halftime, you really need to hedge that bet. And
by the way, I
go ahead.
I just wanted to mention that, by the way, apropos of what we were just saying with the point spread, it's hard to see. I mean, I understand the reason for San Francisco being favored, but the thought there is that the way Kansas City has answered those questions by winning at this price range on the road, 2 straight games against 2 of the other leading contenders in the AFC, the books have to believe, and it hasn't happened yet. It happened a little bit. You would expect all the money to come in on Kansas City. What more does Patrick Mahomes have to prove? And by the way, that also does lead to San Francisco being able to look at this game as, even though the betting line says they're favorite, all the talk is on the Chiefs, so they can use it to their advantage, and they could basically take the underdog mentality coming into this game, even though they're slight favorite. Now, as to Greg's question about the in game, perfect example for approaching that. You look at what the point spread is, what the line is for, will either team have a lead of X points? What will the biggest lead in the game be? Okay, 14.5 is the number. So if that is indeed correct, that could indicate that there will be some swings in the game where, in theory, you might be able to get both teams as an underdog price. Unless you believe it's going to be a blowout, and 14.5 will look like a very small lead, and most people don't expect it. But a lot of these props, for example, that look like, gee, there's no way it can happen. It's the 2 best teams in the league, 14.5 point. Well, the odds makers, they know what they're doing when they put up a line like that, and it's pretty similar to situations where will a team score? Will a team have 3 unanswered scores? And it's easy to say, no, it's a Super Bowl. You're not going to have that kind of domination. Yet, number one, it happens much more often than it doesn't that a team scores 3 times in a row. And when you want to play that proposition, people, the general public, the occasional bettors will take the no, because that's the plus price, when in fact the price on the will there be, the answer for the yes there will be, is often priced at somewhere between 240 and 280 minus.
Very good.
Let's,
Greg, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Let's move on to our next subject or topic that we got on hand for our listeners out there, if you will.
All right. Let's talk about Super Bowl history. Super Bowl history. So you were talking before, Jim, about how we all went through those really bad years of blowouts. And then people started talking about, well, that's because you're giving them 2 weeks off. Remember that? Remember there was the 2-week off debate. There's too much time in between the Super Bowl, et cetera, et cetera. They were just trying to figure out, how do we make these games closer? And it's just the way that it is. Remember, the NFC used to be on the side of the team that used to dominate the AFC. It was just a 10-year deal. It was just going on and on and on. So let me ask you about Super Bowl history. How much do you take that into account, Jim, when you're handicapping the Super Bowl?
Because they used to be blowouts?
Well, no, just generally speaking. Super Bowl history, the history of the game, when you've looked at the last couple of years, the last 5 years, the last 10 years, do you take into account, or what do you take into account, if anything, regarding Super Bowl history?
Factor, right.
Well, I think that, you could use a lot of statistics. DVOA, I mean, how many yards you gain per average per rush, your average gain per pass, your completion ratio, touchdown to the interception, stuff like that. But in a game like this, especially with a very inexperienced quarterback on one side, I don't know what the hell we're going to get from him. And believe me, when I say this, I like Brock Purdy. I think he's going to be excellent. He's a good thinker. He's very accurate with he's not a big arm, but he's accurate. He's got some good legs. He gains some yards on the ground. I think he's got a great future. I think he's very fortunate that he landed in a spot with an offensive coordinator and a lot of great talent, which is why he's taken off so quickly. I think they messed up when they didn't draft him. Mr. Irrelevant should be the entire crew of people that didn't draft him, because he is not irrelevant at all. He has a lot of talent. But I think that's because of that. I don't know that I can look at statistics in a game this big and say, how do I apply that to a guy like him? I don't know what the hell he's going to do. I mean, if you'll go back to the Baltimore game, when Baltimore went out there to play them, and right now, and at that point, San Francisco was at top of the world, but we didn't realize, I don't think enough of us realized, the loss of Trent Williams and how much that would mean, and it was big. But he got hassled, and he did not do well when he was rushed and pressured. He's going to get rushed and pressured. And what's he going to do with that? What's Kyle going to do to protect him? I don't know. So what I do and what I have done, and I mentioned it before, I went back to the experience level. I like Mahomes in this spot. I like Andy Reid in this spot. I like Spagnuolo in this spot. I like Kelsey in this spot, but I don't give him a real edge. I think that's kind of equal. But in that situation, I had to go to something to really kind of break the tie. And I can't just go in there and say Purdy's going to be crap in this game because it's too big of a game and it's his first time at this stage. I can't say that because I don't know. But I do know that Mahomes is going to come in ready to play. So with Mahomes having an edge, Andy having an edge, Spagnuolo having an edge, I'm going with that.
Well, I would say that if I were back in the presidential election days when they broke the news that Dewey won the election and he didn't, just reading between the lines of what Jim just said, I think I would know what I would send out there as far as the side Jim Feist likes in the game. But we'll find that out officially just a little bit more in the show.
By the way, I was just going to mention as far as what Jim was saying, and that is, and I'll mention it. I would give Kelsey the edge over Kittle only because of the quarterback who's throwing to him and has done so for so many years. But as far as Kittle versus Kelsey as pure tight ends, I think they're both outstanding. And as far as Super Bowl history goes, it's nice to put in newsletters and make for topics of conversation for the media and things like that. But I think the two most important things that we talked about, and Mark, you brought them up, history suggests that underdogs, certainly over the past decade and a half or so, have done exceptionally well, as has the team that comes in with the weaker record, because often the weaker record is not that much, but it's still a good enough record to have made the playoffs and win the 2 or 3 games needed. So I think the history lesson is, don't blindly play favorites as a lot of people blindly do during the regular season or recreation. Well, the 49ers are better, they should win. If you like the 49ers, and there are many reasons to like it, don't bet it because, or Kansas City, because they're the underdog, just because that's what's happened in the past. But also give respect to the fact that underdogs have had incredible success going back a decade and a half.
Let's play another little game here, because I just kind of made Purdy the issue, or the biggest issue, of why I slid away from them, although I feel other edges also lean to Kansas City. If we took Purdy off of this team and put Stafford on the team from the Rams, now I would have to say we got a problem because he is really good. He's going to be in the Hall of Fame. He's, at least on any given day, he's an equal to Mahomes. And now I'd really have to say I'm probably going to switch from what I think might be a defensive game, and there might be some more points. And I'd probably switch from having any side bet, and I'd probably go to the over because of that. Because I think with his capability and experience and being a Super Bowl winner, we're going to see a different kind of game plan.
Well, let me say this, guys, as far as the history is concerned with the Super Bowl, I look at it a little bit differently, and I don't look at it from the standpoint of just pure history being history. I look at it from the standpoint of looking at it from statistical or situational portions of history in Super Bowl games. Things such as, what do favorites of so-and-so do in Super Bowl games? What do number one seeds do in Super Bowl games? A situation like that. What does the straight up winner of a Super Bowl game do? Situations like that. Teams who fail to score 20 points. They're 2-25 straight up. Things like that. To me, that's history. That's handicapping situational history in a Super Bowl game. And there are some points to be made here. I mentioned about Super Bowl favorites of 5 or fewer points. When they had played with a week of rest, bye week to begin the season, they've really struggled. They're only 4-14 to the spread. So to me, that's history. That's situational history. That's my approach to it. Greg, I don't know about you and how you look at it.
Actually, I was taking one out of Andy's newsletter, and this one really reminded me what we talked about before the season began, that the AFC was just clearly a more deeper conference than the NFC. Matter of fact, it was getting so ridiculous. Sean Payton decides, well, where am I going? I'm going to go to an AFC team. It's like everybody's going to an AFC team. It's getting ridiculous. The AFC is stocked. Aaron Rodgers, where's he going? He's going to an AFC team. Everybody going to the AFC. And so it should have been no surprise that, as Andy pointed out in the newsletter, that the AFC 46-34 versus the NFC this year. That's a 57.5% winning percentage. That's the best since 2009. And I just think that back then we thought before the season began, the AFC, even though they were deeper, and yes, San Francisco and Philly was in the NFC, that the AFC should have an advantage come whoever was going to represent them in the Super Bowl. And I think that's another historical edge that makes a lot of sense to me.
By the way,
Excellent.
along those lines,
Excellent.
it's not always the best indicator, but it's a reasonable indicator as to how the lines maker looks at things. They've just come out within the last couple of weeks, the Super Bowl odds for next season, the 2024 season. Take a look. I haven't done it yet, or I'd share it with you, but take a look at what the distribution of the shorter odd teams are. Are there more AFC or NFC teams priced, for example, at 40-1 or 30-1 or less? That'll give you an idea of the lines maker's assessment of the strength between the conferences, at least heading into the offseason, which may be about 60 to 70% of how the teams will look heading into the regular season of 2024.
Excellent point, Andy.
That's really good.
Let me close this segment out here, Andy. I'm going to throw this one right back to you as well. And I know in your awesome newsletter this week, you mentioned about third time a charm becomes a charm. It's a saying that's often said, the third time becomes a charm. I got to ask you, for which team? I know you hit on that in your Super Bowl newsletter. Expound on that, if you would, a little bit.
Yeah, in fact, I had I sort of put a little caption at the start of each newsletter, sort of just something topical or whatever. And so I said, the headline in this newsletter, third time is the charm, but for which team?
Right.
And by that I meant the San Francisco 49ers have won 5 Super Bowls. Their last win was in 1994 when they beat up on the then San Diego Chargers. So it's been nearly 30 years since they won that 5th Super Bowl. In that time, they've had 2 opportunities. The one was the Harbaugh Bowl back about a decade or so ago with brother John beating brother Jim when Jim was the 49ers coach. John was still at Baltimore. And, of course, that's the one where the lights went out and they had the fiasco at the start of the third quarter. The second time was, of course, in Super Bowl 54 when the 49ers lost to the Kansas City Chiefs. So this is their third opportunity, and maybe appropriately it'd be almost 3 full decades since they won that last Super Bowl, that they may be the one for whom the third's the charm. At the same time, it's a little bit easier. Third time's the charm for Kansas City because a third win here would be the third win for the Andy Reid, Pat Mahomes combination, and it would also be Kansas City's, I think, 4th Super Bowl win overall, dating back to their win over the Vikings in number 4.
One more quickie, Andy, before we get out of this segment here. You mentioned absolutely incredible Super Bowl facts. Would you share some of those with us?
I think one of them was the one that we talked about as far as the record of those teams that you sort of pointed out first. And I'm trying to locate it here. Phil, you'll give me just a half a moment or so to do it. But there are a lot of things that I look at. Just in fact, I call it some absolutely amazing Super Bowl facts. It's worth noting that I mentioned the one about the team with the weaker record and the fact that the team with the weaker record has something gone like 15 or 16-2 against the spread over the last since I think the start of the millennium.
Actually, Andy, you had it at 6. The team with the weaker record was 11-6 straight up, and 15-2 against the spread since 2002.
Right, and that's the one where we had the exceptions about the New England win over Atlanta, right, and the other one with the Gruden factor. In the last 17 games, you'd have to go back prior to the Tampa Bay win, which was the last time that prior to that situation. You have to go back to 1994 when the 13-3 San Francisco 49ers defeated the 11-5 San Diego in that Super Bowl. So it's been a long time. And I do indicate that, sadly, this factor did not apply last season, but it does this season. I think that was the one that I was really taking a look at as far as illustrating just how important it is or how significant it may be that the team with the weaker record, and you might also think that from that standpoint, they could also play that underdog factor regardless of the point spread. I will point out also that we've had a lot of, by the way, third time's the charm also. This could be the third straight year that the Super Bowl's been decided by exactly 3 points. So keep that in mind when you take a look at the pricing on will the game be decided by exactly 3 points. It's about plus 4.5 to plus 5 to 1 for something that's happened about 1/3 of all Super Bowls going back to the start of the millennium. But that the underdog, the weaker record does give the underdog mentality because of the fact that we're not supposed to be, we're not as good as the team that had the better record. I will point out that if you do take a look at the schedules, San Francisco actually played a greater number of games against quality teams. And I define a quality team in the NFL as any team that wins at least 10 games in the regular season. Now, of course, you can also argue, well, yeah, they beat 9-8 Green Bay and 12-5 Detroit. San Francisco did, as opposed to Baltimore beating Baltimore, Buffalo, and Miami, each 10-win teams, losing to Kansas City.
Yeah, and another one you had, Andy, was and even though you might not think it'll matter in this one, was that point spreads not mattering in the Super Bowl for 12 straight years and 15 of the last 16, meaning that if you win the game, you're covering the game.
The only exception happened 2 years ago when Cincinnati was favored by 3.5 or 4, and the Rams were favored by 3.5 or 4, and I think the final score was 23-20. So the underdog Bengals cashed in that one, which is the only time that's happened. I think we said since 2009.
All right, guys, with that, let's hand it back over to Greg. And I want to remind everybody that's listening out there, thanks for joining us on the show. We greatly appreciate it, and we appreciate it even more if you click the like button at the bottom of the page here. That would mean a lot to us, and it'll also keep you in the loop about what we're doing here on Marc Lawrence Against the Spread. Greg, if you would, our next segment, if you will.
Yeah, and also want to remind everybody that this segment is brought to you by uwager.lv, featuring monthly 5% rebates and free same-day payouts. So you can check that out at 1-800-UWAGER. Again, 1-800-UWAGER. You can see that right there on the screen, and you could also see that little segment there that we've already named coaches and quarterbacks that we're going to get to here in just a second. I wanted, though, just to remind everybody as well, not only to hit the like button, but also the subscribe button. So I think we are close to 600 subscribers now. Hopefully we will get to 1,000 before next season. Because keep in mind, because you can't do it yet, but once we're at 1,000 subscribers, then anybody who wants to donate to the channel, things of that nature, we got things like chats and super chats and all that kind of cool stuff. You'll be able to do that. So if you have like a really cool topic or a comment, you'll be able to use those super stickers and all sorts of cool, funny, creative names that YouTube's come up with to get your comment or your question highlighted in our chats. So,
hey, Greg, I would have liked to have said that once we hit 1,000 subscribers, that all the subscribers would be welcome to a party in Jim Feist's backyard.
How about, let's do that, right?
But it'd have to be in Vegas.
All 1,000, yeah. Okay, so let's now talk about experience and intangibles with Andy first, because again, I want to talk about coaches and quarterbacks, but let's talk about that, Andy. Talk about, because I think that obviously the two are connected, and should be connected. So talk about that.
Yeah, we've sort of alluded to this really throughout part of the first hour that we've done as various topics came up, but it almost goes along with, I'll go with one of my long-held beliefs that handicapping betting is both an art and a science. The science being the numbers, the statistics, the art, the intangible situations such as coaching advantages, such as experience, etc. And whereas in the regular season, and you pointed out, Greg, as far as what a lot of people do, they'll look at the statistics, analyze the statistics. For the most part, they play, 272 regular season games, and the vast majority of those games are just one game on the schedule. Yeah, there are certain factors that apply, but statistics are a little bit more, I won't say more valid, but more appropriate to use. And when you get to the playoffs, then the intangibles, the art of the handicapping, I think becomes a lot more important, of which we talked about with I know Jim and Mark mentioned about the experience of the coaches, the quarterbacks, the recency as far as how these teams have performed at various stages of the season. What do you do? In fact, I'll talk about it. I know we're going to get to props at some point, but I talk about even examining game by game. Where did teams play their best? One thing I look at each week during the season, and especially late in the year, is I break the season down into quarters: games 1 through 4, 5 through 8, 9 through 12, and now 13 through 17. It used to be 13 through 16, and I get a pretty good idea of how these teams have played over the course of the season. Have they gotten better? Have they gotten worse? I'll point one out that is a concern for Kansas City. Kansas City has had an issue with turnovers, giving the ball away. If you break down the season into those 4 quarters of 3 of 4 games and 1 of 5, Kansas City has had a negative turnover margin or negative turnover differential in each of those 4 quarters. So it's been a season-long concern for Kansas City's inability to prevent turnovers. At the same time, and this is more of a season-long thing, Kansas City ranks very low as far as near the bottom as far as turnovers lost, but they also rank low defensively in number of turnovers recovered. It's sometimes it's like the bottom third of the league as far as the number of turnovers that the defense has been able to force or recover. Now, do keep in mind, and again, you have to take this in context, is the differential between the best team and the worst team is not like the differential between average rushing yards from the best team to the worst team, which could be 50, 60 yards difference. The average in turnover margins from the best team to the worst might be the difference between plus 12 and minus 12 or something like that. But still, Kansas City has that double concern of an offense that has tended to turn the ball over consistently through the season and has not been able to force turnovers throughout the season as well, at least not to the same extent that San Francisco has excelled in both of those areas. So that, to me, for example, is something that we talked about experience and intangibles. That's one of those things that I would put a little more emphasis on as far as the overall capabilities of these teams, and it would be a concern. You don't have very many concerns for really either team. That one might be significant. In fact, I would say from an experience standpoint, Kansas City has a big edge. From a fundamental standpoint, they are at a disadvantage. At the same time, they have an advantage in the edge of quarterbacks. Are they going to be able, as I mentioned earlier, put the pressure on Brock Purdy and cause him to make the mistakes? And when you do that kind of analysis, you find out that the edge in experience is only a certain point. It may work more to the detriment of the inexperienced team in the first half. They may be slow starters. It may give you an idea that San Francisco, with the less experience, largely due to Purdy, because the other guys are great, it may be a more conservative game plan for San Francisco, not wanting to make that first mistake. And if I'm Shanahan, maybe I take advantage of that maybe I try to go for a big play on the opening play of the game if they happen to have the first possession. You've got to do what the opposition doesn't expect. Andy Reid, Pat Mahomes have much more experience in that area, and that's a lot of reasons for why a lot of folks do support Kansas City on that factor. But again, and it goes to one thing you talked about earlier, Greg, it does present opportunities throughout the game to take advantage of in-play wagering, and it also suggests that this game could come down to the fourth quarter, as I talked about earlier. The first Super Bowl meeting came down to the fourth quarter. And one of the props is, will either team or will both teams at some point in the fourth quarter have a lead? Well, it was true in that Super Bowl. Might very well be true in this one, even though it does look one-sided early in the game.
What about quarterbacks? Go ahead, Jim. What about quarterbacks, coaches? I know you've already talked about this, the experience factor.
Yes. We could go one step along the experience factor to the kid. We haven't talked about this at all. And since we're talking about the possibility of a very close game in the fourth quarter coming down to a play, there's a thing called field goal kicking. And I really think that San Francisco with Moody is a big underdog for accuracy. Yes, he has got Moody has a big leg, but he is not accurate.
Makes some big misses too, Jim.
Yes. And Butker has, knock on wood, I don't jinx him, but this guy's been excellent. And there's experiences again, right there. And he's an old bro, and the other kid's a kid.
What about the difference between the coaches and the quarterbacks in this matchup, Jim? Heavy advantage to Kansas City?
Very heavy. Very.
I agree.
I just do not believe we know what Purdy's going to bring to this game. He has not looked, against Green Bay, didn't look good in the first part of the game. They got way behind. Definitely looked like they could have lost that game. Against Detroit, again, way behind, 17 down at the half. Who knew what, that was going to turn around the way it did? But, and then you have to question Dan Campbell's coaching. The guy brought them that far into the playoffs with that type of coaching and those decisions that he made. But, maybe some of that was against some pretty bad teams that he got away with it. But when you're in the playoffs, you're not playing pretty bad teams.
See, it's interesting on that one, because if he makes the other decision and it fails, people will then say, why didn't you do what you did all the time, going the way you did? Because it worked. Your team has confidence in it. So sometimes I think he got crucified a little bit too harshly, simply because what he chose to do didn't work where it had in the past. But you mentioned earlier about some of the field goal issues. That is that you take advantage of that in some of the props as well. That Butker, probably second or third best kicker right now. You got to go with the Baltimore kicker right now, with how solid he's been over the years. But yeah, kicking is important. In fact, there's like one prop, and it may very well come down to San Francisco being the team that wins this prop. There's one prop that says, will any punt be downed, fair caught, or go out of bound at or within the opponent's 5-yard line? Well, if you're let's say if you're Kansas City and you're on the San Francisco 40, that would be like a 57, 58-yard field goal. You probably try it with a guy like Butker. If it's the other way around with a guy like Moody and the 49ers are on the Kansas City 40-yard line, maybe you do try a punt, because maybe you say the odds of pinning Kansas City back, depending upon the situation, time in the game, etc., is better than risking a long field goal that if you miss, and it's a higher probability that Moody would miss such a field goal than Butker would, you then give Kansas City great field position.
Hey guys, let me do this. I'm going to reel this subject in here because we've got about 50 minutes left on our live podcast, and we've got a lot to cover coming up here. Just in closing, I want to say this about the quarterbacks and the coaches, if I may. If you take a look at Patrick Mahomes and his body of work, he's won 6 straight games against Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Tua Tagovailoa, Jalen Hurts, Joe Burrow, and Trevor Lawrence. That's a pretty nice murderer's row that he's taking care of. You also take a look at him, his last 4 playoff games. He's not turned the ball over or been sacked in any of those 4 football games. Those are big check marks, I think, for him as opposed to Brock Purdy. On the coaching side, one little neat Andy Reid stat. If you like stats, there's a lot of people out there that like this kind of stuff, I being one of them. Andy Reid, when his teams have won and covered each of their previous 2 games and he dresses up as an underdog, he is 21-3-1 against the spread in this particular role.
Oh, wow.
By the way, is that just with Kansas City, or does it go back to Philadelphia?
That's his career with Philadelphia too as well. Yes.
Okay.
By the way, does somebody have their cell phone on that has the broadcast of our show in the background? Because I can hear it.
No. I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm getting a little reverb.
Yeah, one of us does. They probably have their cell phone on, and what happened is it picked up the show, and you're probably not even realizing it. So if you have your cell phone on, you might as well just move it away from the screen. Everybody should move away from the screen.
It may be somebody in my office. I don't know.
Okay, just letting somebody, if anybody out there in our studio, just to let you know. Our next segment is going to be offense versus defense and the importance of offense versus defense in the Super Bowl. I grew up, especially in the days of the Chicago Bears and Buddy Ryan and how defense wins championships. I know offenses have been, the rules, and everybody wants points. And look what the Super Bowls we've seen recently with all the points being scored, even just last year. But what about that? I'll start with you, Jim. What about still the importance of offense versus defense?
Okay, just want to double check. Thanks a lot. Okay.
Well, the rules have changed, and it's very difficult for a defense to control a game now because of the offensive changes by the committees and the powers to be. They wanted more scoring. They made defensive play very difficult. But in the playoffs, they're not calling a lot of those penalties that they call in the regular season. They're letting them play a little bit more. So that takes a little bit of it away and allows some of the defensive players to do a little bit more than they have done during the regular season. And I've seen that pretty much in all the playoff games. Offenses are, I give an offensive edge to Kansas City. I think they have better material and they have a better defensive head coach. That's one of the edges we talked about earlier. And, the regular season and the playoffs are officiated differently. And it's remarkable, actually. And they're letting the defensive people get away with a little bit more than they do in the regular season.
By the way, speaking of refs,
maybe that's due to having supposedly, quote unquote, better officiating crews in these playoff games.
Well, speaking of refs, we do have some in the chat that have brought up the officiating and what it could do to impact the game. Rick White, why is the Super Bowl experience, or what is the Super Bowl experience of the refs? I think it should be what over why. They can make a big difference in the game. And Rick also says, that's what he says. He changes to what. And then Dave McKenna. Now, Dave, I'm assuming you're either my age or older to make this reference. Hopefully this game won't be so suspicious that it looks like a race from Freehold Raceway.
By the way, that brings up a point that I think we've discussed before. With the NFL's endorsement and participation in legalized sports betting, I would think that the NFL should strongly consider, even though it slows things down, every play, including some of those very questionable pass interference calls that could be called very arguably on either the receiver or the defender, should be reviewable. And if you want to make it subject to the use of a challenge under the current system, that's fine. The alternative to that is you liberalize, for example, the offensive holding rules, the jostling rules, because the NFL, if they've always expressed a long-term concern, rightfully so, about the integrity of the game and making sure that everything's on the up and up, the officials, and everyone has known this, control basically what can happen in any game. You can always overcome a touchdown by throwing a late penalty flag or something like that. It is a concern. I did not do any research on the referees specifically, and I know people are out there, and it's probably on the internet somewhere, involved in this game, because there are some websites out there that do check and report on which officiating crews call a certain higher than normal percentage of offensive holding, defensive interference, etc. And that is something that could go into the handicap, especially when you're looking at what kind of penalties are called. If you're looking at defensive pass interference, that might tend to prefer or lean you towards playing overs. If you're looking at it because it gives the offense extra yards from a play that otherwise didn't work. If you're looking at offensive line holdings or kickoff, punt return holding penalties, that might prefer a lower scoring game because you're taking away yards that have previously been gained.
And is anybody in any way, shape, or form concerned about the officiating in general? I mean, if any team has gotten screwed by the officiating this year, it's been the Kansas City Chiefs. That's for sure. I think their fans are probably more nervous about this game with officiating than the Niners fans. So,
do we know who the officials are and what record they may have had? Do we know that yet?
Yeah, we should
It's been
know.
announced. I don't have it in front of me, but I know it was announced, I think, within days after the conference championship game. In fact, I think it may have even been announced before them. The conference championship games were played.
All right.
The officiating has me as a bettor become a little bit more leery as to making larger bets than I had before, because it does change, and some of the, even when they review the plays, it's unbelievable some of the decisions they make. So some of my betting has no, all of my betting has been reduced because I don't always trust that the decisions are made efficiently, effectively. I don't question the honesty because I think they do a pretty good job policing the officials and what goes on in their lives and how much, but you never can rule it out. But a lot of people say, oh, fixed game, fixed game. I don't believe that. Can it happen? Of course. We've seen it before. Will we see it again? Of course we will. But widespread, no. I don't believe
The
it.
only concern that I have, or the only thing I would like, consistency. If it's a pass interference play called in the first quarter, you call it the same way in the fourth quarter.
I agree with that, Andy. Totally.
All right, let's move on to our next segment, common denominators. So the importance of utilizing common denominators when it comes to handicapping the Super Bowl. Start with you, Mark.
Well, we broke this down in the Playbook Super Bowl preview guide, and the common denominator shook out pretty even, surprisingly. I think they played 7 common opponent teams, and there was no big edge either straight up or against the spread. I think the biggest edge was San Francisco struggled 2-5 to the spread against those common opponents, whereas Kansas City, I believe, went 4-3. But Andy, I know you broke down in your fabulous newsletter your common opponents and strength of schedules. Can you hit on that if you would?
Yeah, the common opponents were Minnesota, Cincinnati, Jacksonville, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Green Bay, and Detroit. So they each played 7. San Francisco played more of those games they played 2 of them in the playoffs, Green Bay and Detroit. Kansas City, I think, had those 3 games that they played, or the games late in the year that San Francisco played also. They both played Baltimore, of course. Both teams were 4-3 in their 7 games against the common opponents. As you noted, San Francisco 2-5 against the spread. Kansas City 4-3, so a 2-game difference there. What's interesting is the contrast in the totals results. San Francisco's 7 games against the same opponents, 4-3 to the over. Kansas City 6-1 to the under. So Kansas City against the same opponent. So that there's again, maybe that's the old offense-defense comparison that you want to make. In fact, San Francisco's average margin was plus 3.8, 26.7 to 22.9 as the score goes. So that's basically 49.5, 50 points. Kansas City's significantly lower, 20.3 to 17.9. That's 2.4, basically 38 points per game. So that's an 11-point differential between the two. And it's a decent enough sample. I don't know statistically how significant it is based upon the mathematics behind it, but you're talking about 7 games out of 19 for San Francisco, and 20 for Kansas City. So it's more than a third of their games that are against common opponents. So I think that you can take a look at that. As far as the stats on the game, not huge difference between them. San Francisco was a little bit better offensively as far as yards per play gained on offense. Kansas City, not quite as of an edge when you look at defensive yards allowed per play. That was more to the edge of Kansas City, but San Francisco's offensive edge was greater, but not by a significant amount. So they both played well. They both had winning records. The difference was in the point spread, but keep again in mind, Ed, in both of those games, and especially in San Francisco's case, they were laying huge numbers in many of those games that they won but did not cover.
Very good. Like I said, common opponents really weren't a factor here. Sometimes they are, and even when they are, sometimes they can be skewed or misleading from the standpoint of what was the condition of the opponent when they played the game. Were they struggling? Were they a losing team? Did they improve in the second half of the season?
Exactly.
Yeah, so you have to take those with a grain of salt for sure.
The other thing to offset that is that it probably applied to both teams at different times, and that's why looking at 7 common games is you probably got a variety of healthy teams, weak teams in each of those samples, as opposed to if they only had 3 common foes, where there's more likely that there could be a significant edge in the difference of competition at the time of those teams played.
All right. One more in the chat before we move on to, I think this is going to be our final segment, and that is a question from Champ Ross, Fantasy Boxing Predictions League. Quick prop question for panel. Good segue.
Yes.
Combined net yards combined for both teams over under 726. So what do you think, guys? Again, combined net yards
I
combined
will
for both
say
teams?
this. My inclination was initially to look under, especially when I take a look. Kansas City's defense this year is the best defense that Mahomes has ever had behind him to support him by far. And again, it just shows the difference. I said Spagnuolo was in his first year with Kansas City when they met in the first Super Bowl. He didn't have all his players there. He now has mostly all of his players that he's been able to acquire or that management has been able to acquire for him. At the same time, this is Kansas City's weakest offense that Mahomes has played behind. Talked about it earlier about the number of drop passes, but just the offense as a whole has been weaker. In fact, last season, 2022, this is a weaker offense than then. Last season's offense produced 59 offensive touchdowns rushing and passing. This year, that number was down to 37. So that explains why Kansas City's average points per game this year was between 6 and 7 points, I believe, less than it was last year. At the same time, this is a better San Francisco team that Kansas City saw in the first Super Bowl. Mentioned that Garoppolo was the quarterback, McCaffrey wasn't on the team, and Sammy was a rookie. By the way, this is not the first time these teams have met. They actually met in 2022 in midseason in San Francisco. San Francisco got out again to a 10-0 lead. Kansas City caught him right before half, took a 14-13 lead. This was in San Francisco, and Kansas City had to lead the rest of the way. It was 44-23. Interesting enough, it was McCaffrey's first game after the trade from Carolina. So they have met before, and at the same time, we saw Kansas City once again be able to contain San Francisco in the second half. And by the way, you go back to that Baltimore game in the championship game, Kansas City did what it did most of the season. They didn't, or not most of it. Well, they had a poor second half. They did not score after getting that 17-7 halftime lead. In fact, if you look at the performance of these teams' first half and second half, San Francisco was very consistent in what they produced offensively and even held teams defensively in the first half and the second half. Better in the first half than the second half. Kansas City was much better, slightly weaker than San Francisco in the first half. But when you look at what they did in the second half, they were pretty good defensively, but absolutely horrible offensively. In fact, they ranked, I think it was tied with the Jets for the fewest points scored in the second half of their games this year.
Their under record in the second half and in the fourth quarter was the best under record in the league.
Yeah.
All right. I also want to remind everybody to check out uwager.lv, who is sponsoring this segment. Featuring 58% free play with 6-time rollover and no hold. That's 1-800-UWAGER. Again, 1-800-UWAGER. 58% free play with 6-time rollover and no hold. If nobody knows what that means, what does it mean, Mark?
Jim, you know all about rollover.
I do. Well, you post up. Everybody does it differently, but if you have to win $600 to start collecting, that means you got to, let's say you make a $100 deposit, but you got to build it up to 600.
You got to build it 6 times, right?
Yeah, 6 times. Some places are 10 times. I remember one place was 12 times. So it's pretty hard to roll over to get to 12 times to ever start getting your money. So the lower the rollover, the more honest the whole proposition and promotion is.
All right, so let's talk props, and as we talk props,
this is going to take a whole segment. I
have to ask you, Andy, to kick things off, because you've done more than enough homework on this one. Give me your best prop advice.
Okay, well, we talked about the newsletter, and actually the most important part of the newsletter may very well be the final page of text where I put 5 key points to consider when playing props. Not necessarily in any order because they're all important. Number 1, when looking to play props, look for sports books that offer a 20-cent difference in the line as opposed to a 30% for competitively priced props. In other words, a minus 110 each way is a 20-cent line. Don't, if you can find the same price or same type prop, don't play minus 115 versus minus 115. That's a huge advantage for the sports books, and there are plenty of books that offer the 20-cent line rather than the 30-cent line. Perhaps I would say this is the most important bit of advice. Be sure to read the fine print attached to a prop, because there are many conditions, such as, does a player have to play for action? If there's no touchdown, is that a refund, or is it the under in that specific prop a winner? And check around for the various different types of props. Receiving yards, rushing yards for specific players will vary depending upon the amount of action that certain sports books get. So it's important to look around and shop around for the best props. When evaluating props involving yards, attempts, receptions, etc., it may be best to not just look at the related season averages that a player has accomplished or a team has accomplished, but rather look at the number of games in which a player may have exceeded or fallen short of the number that's being used as the number for that prop. Is an extreme example. A running back may have gained 50 yards in 60 games this year for a total of 800, and then in that 17th game, whenever it was, had 210 yards, an outlier performance, but the average yards is 1,000. 1,010 is the total yards for a 17-game average of 59.4 yards per game, a total he would have topped just once in that 210-yard game. So be very careful, or at least you certainly would want to consider looking at the number of times that number has been achieved. It's not always right or close to the average, which means brings up another thought for those of you familiar with the concept of medians. If you rank let's say, a simple example, teams played 17 games. If you ranked all points scored in each of those 17 games from the lowest, let's say 3 points, to the highest of 45 points, the number in the middle, number 9, is the median. See how that also compares to whether or not the player or the team has fallen short or gone over. And finally, understand that for the most part, the public at large, the casual once-a-year bettors, will tend to think positive rather than negative terms. Therefore, they will often look to be playing the yes rather than the no, and the over rather than the under. As a result, and a lot of the folks who have been doing it for a while realize that intrinsic value in most of the props will be on the no and on the under. The professionals largely look for things not to occur as opposed to things to occur. The bookmakers know that, so they shade it a little bit more towards what the professionals don't get the big advantage of. So often you will be, that's another reason, knowing that the unsophisticated money, let's call it that, will be coming in on wanting things to happen, go over, or yes, be accomplished.
Very good. Let me jump in here, if I may, as far as some of these props go that I came across. My favorite props are anti-Purdy props. I'm going to play him over a half an interception. I'm going to play him under his passing yards. And I'm also going to play Isaiah Pacheco with a touchdown, to score a touchdown in the football game. This is a neat stat that I came across really just literally before we started the show. And Isaiah Pacheco has recorded at least 75 yards from scrimmage in each of his last 6 playoff games. There have only been 7 players since the merger that have a longer streak. One of those is Travis Kelce, by the way, with 7, also Deebo Samuel with 6. But nice support for Isaiah Pacheco. I think personally, if I'm Andy Reid, their game plan is to keep control of the football, utilize Pacheco, and put the heat on Brock Purdy in this football game. So I'm anti-Purdy from interceptions, anti-Purdy for yards, and on Pacheco. Also, one little quick note here, guys, in passing here, something I come across. Will there be a touchdown run of 3.5 or less yards? The answer is overwhelmingly yes in situations like that. So, while it goes against the yes bet, there are oftentimes really rather quite small scores in the football games. And in closing, before I turn it over to Jim and Greg, if I may, in our Super Bowl newsletter, we had pointed out a couple of unique stats that we saw in props, and these were from our friends over at VSiN. And they were pretty neat. Will there be a punt return for a touchdown? It hasn't. It's been 22 years. It's been 0 times. Will the longest field goal be over 54.5 yards? 22 times, 22 occurrence years, 0 times. Will a player with 200 plus receiving yards in a football game last 22 years? 0 times. And I mentioned to you before about the shortest touchdown of under three and a half yards. The answer to that is last 22 times, 21 times it's happened. So those are some little tidbits of mine that I found most interesting when it comes to props. And I'm going to tip my hat also to my good friend Jay Cornegay over at the Superbook. Jay is sort of the originator, the godfather, if you will, when it comes to Super Bowl props. He originally did this on a whim, and it ended up being magnificently popular. People bet more money on props than they do the Super Bowl games these days. And he did it largely because it allowed the books to be able to take more handle on the football game itself. And he put over 500 props with the Superbook. Check out online superbook.com and check out all the props that Jay Cornegay put up. That's my little plug for Jay Cornegay and the Superbook, a sports book that I absolutely love.
Well, Jay has always done a great job over there, and remarkable how he comes up with all this stuff. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because there's quite a few of them. The first, I bet a teaser in the game. Chiefs. I took the 2.5, went with the 8.5 and under 54. I feel pretty good about that. Matter of fact, the only thing that a little question about it, the game gets out of hand, the 54 may not stand up, but it's still at 47.5 for the most part. So I think I got a pretty good edge there. Purdy, I think I like over rushing yards. Now, I didn't mention any numbers here because they're moving around a lot. So I don't want to put out a number that's not available. Just shop everywhere you can for the best prices.
I saw 13 to 13.5 in the last 24 hours.
Well, I just look what I betted at 11.5.
Yeah.
So, McCaffrey over 35.5 rushing yards. Pacheco, Mark, you mentioned him, over rushing yards. Pacheco over rushing attempts. Kelsey over 6.5 receptions. Butker over 1.5 field goals. I do not feel that Andy is going to be going on fourth down very much. He's just not that kind of coach. And I think he's going to get the points and try to hold on and play the conservative game at the end of the game. Both teams combined over 3.5 field goals by both teams. That's my list.
Your laundry list, huh?
It's
I've got a few interesting ones to sort of testament to the creativity of some books. These are from the Circa. And if I were going to label this prop, I would call it the Lamar Jackson prop. The prop is, will any player complete a pass to himself? Of course, we saw that in that game, in the championship game. Actually, in that one, I'm not going to suggest playing it because the price, if you play it 75 to 1 on the yes, you can also lay minus 275 on the no. The second such prop I would call the Zay Flowers prop. Will a player fumble the ball outside, over the end zone, over the goal line, into the end zone, and out of the end zone for a touchback? That's what that one should have been labeled. And now, what fun would chat about the Super Bowl be without a conspiracy theory that would help the Kansas City bettors, but would seem to help the Kansas City bettors, but might actually help the San Francisco bettors. And that is, the line right now is 2. If you're Kansas City, you'd love to get the +3. So here's my thoughts. On her way home from Japan, on Saturday night after her concert, Taylor Swift, you start a rumor Sunday morning that on the flight home, Taylor Swift called Travis Kelce to break up with him. All of a sudden, everyone will rush to bet San Francisco, and the Kansas City bettors will be saying, we're going to get the +3 we had hoped for.
Because of a distraught Travis Kelce. Yes, I got it.
Not going to happen. Not going to happen, but there have been all sorts of conspiracy theories thrown out about this for the NFL. I thought I'd add one that has even less chance of occurring.
We appreciate it, Andy. That was a good one.
Although the number 13 has come up quite a bit. I've made a number of props, and it's interesting to shop around. There's an overtime prop that is usually priced about +900. It's only happened once, that Atlanta-New England game. A lot of people expect Travis Kelce to catch a touchdown at some point. And it's a pretty low number on Travis Kelce. If you are someone who wants to play, not the Travis Kelce prop necessarily, but the overtime prop, you can actually get better than 9-1 overall on the overtime prop, or at least 9-1 or better, because there's one prop that's actually a dual prop. Travis Kelce scores a touchdown, doesn't have to be a catch, scores a touchdown, and 49ers win the game. And there's a similarly worded prop. Travis Kelce catches a touchdown pass, and the Chiefs win the game. One, I think, is like 22-1. The other one is like 20-1. So effectively, you're getting 20-1. So you're effectively getting like 10.5-1 on the two props. So because you'd have to bet twice as much on Travis Kelce just to catch a touchdown pass. So those are some of the props.
I saw a parlay that might be interesting. I'll let you guys discuss it. It's McCaffrey anytime TD, parlayed with Kelce anytime TD, and Mahomes anytime TD. And if you want to get real creative, add a fourth one. I know what that pays. That pays like 130-1. So
who was the last? What was the last one?
That was Mahomes, Kelce, and McCaffrey. But you could add Purdy in there.
Oh, okay.
TV. Now you have a four-way parlay. I don't know what it pays because I didn't bet it.
Yeah.
But it's all possible. I mean, what can go on here? It's a fun bet. And God, if you have three of them going into the fourth quarter, you're going to be pretty excited because that thing's going to be paying over 201.
Yeah, the other thing is when you look at the number of players to catch, to have a reception, number of Chiefs, for example, for rushing yards, that's usually around 4.5 or 5.5. You want to take a look at the number of games in which the team actually had 4 different players or 5 different players have a rushing attempt, or 7 or 8 different players, because that's another thing you want to keep an eye on, because we often expect a lot of trick plays. I would say like over 2.5 players to have a pass attempt. That very rarely happens. Now, if you had betted in the NFC Championship game last year between Philadelphia and San Francisco, you would have had it because of the injury to that occurred during the game to Purdy and the other San Francisco quarterbacks. But it rarely happens unless they have someone who comes in for a series or two to replace an temporarily injured starter.
One other thing, guys, I heard it's becoming a popular prop. If for no other reason, its name is funky, and it's worked here a little bit of late. It's called the octopus.
Yeah.
Where one player will score 8 points on a possession, where he scores the touchdown and he converts the 2 points. And that was the case for Jalen Hurts last year. Whether or not somebody will complete an octopus, I have no clue, no idea. I just thought it was kind of neat. I'd throw that out there to see whether or not it's being offered by your guy or not.
I haven't seen a price. Andy, did you see a price?
I'll try and find it right now, but I know that I've seen the prop at about 4 or 5 different properties. It's a difficult thing because number one, you have to decide to go for 2 after scoring the touchdown. Number 2, it has to be the same. You have to complete it. And you have to complete it to the same person who scored the touchdown. So I know that there are pretty long odds.
With Hurts, you got the advantage. You got the tush push.
That's true. Unfortunately, you can't do it this year, but that is something to keep in mind for the future, because I'm sure that this will be a popular prop because it does contain. I'm going to try and find out what it is.
What's your top? What would be your top money line play of all wagers in the Super Bowl?
I do the tandem prop, which I've talked about a lot over the years. A tandem prop is basically 2 props, and it's a way that I approach a lot of the props, and it means it has no connection at all to who I think is going to win. It's a prop that just has 2 separate parts, like the first pass by each quarterback, complete or incomplete. The complete, which again is the popular part of the prop, is usually priced around -240, -250. The incomplete is usually priced around +190 to +200, and I've generally played each of those props because you only need one of them to come in and you're going to show a profit. You lose 2 units if both quarterback's first pass is complete. You win close to 4 units if both of them are complete, and you win about 1 unit if you go 1-1. Now, it was very successful for a long period of time in the 20 teens. It had not hit, I think, for 2 or 3 years last year because both were complete. Last year it went 1-1, so I think I was plus 190 on one end of the prop and plus 210 on the other end of the prop. So effectively, I won like either 90 or 110. Depending on, I forget which one it came in. So I look at it. This one hasn't been. This is an example of the type of thing you look for. Will the first punt by the Kansas City punter be will the Kansas City punter punt a touchback? Will the San Francisco punter punt a touchback? You only need one of the two. It's irrelevant as to what you think is going to happen throughout the game, other than it does require there to be several punt opportunities for each quarterback. But I generally play the quarterback incomplete first pass almost every year.
Or you could just bet $1 million on the coin flip.
There you go. Get it over with.
By the way, that goes into another thing, and I'm surprised Jay has not taken advantage of it. Most places give you heads and tails, and it's minus 102, minus 103 each way. There was a time when I think it was the Westgate for a year or two actually made it a true minus 100 each way, and that way they could advertise to the world, come and play at our sportsbook. We have VIG-free props. As long as you have two of them, the plural applies. I won't say it's deceptive or something misleading or anything. It's a true statement, but it's not quite what you would hope it would be, but it certainly lives up to the billing of what it actually is.
What about money lines in general? Do you guys have any, not props necessarily, but any other wagers? Like, for instance, if I'm looking for a money line play, I'm probably going to throw a few bucks on Kansas City winning anywhere between 8 and 14 points or more, because I can get 3-1, between 3-1 and plus 650 to 1 if the game is decided in before the fourth quarter, pretty much of a 14 or more game. Which I think, again, if Brock Purdy has a bad game, if he throws a few interceptions, things of that nature, then I think Kansas City does have a good chance of winning the game by more than 14 points.
My biggest concern to that, Greg, is that Andy Reid is the one coach in the National Football League that plays more one-score games than any other coach. And Kansas City is sort of famous for that. Yeah. Which is why they've won the Super Bowl, or maybe New England won Super Bowls and didn't cover. Kansas City does it during the season as well with Andy Reid. So I might be a little bit concerned about that one particular one for that reason.
I talked about tandem bets. Another category is head-to-head bets. A versus B, yes, no, etc. And the third kind is what you talked about. It's either you call it an index bet. I call it a multi-option bet, where there might be 10 to 20 different options, such as you talk. Kansas City wins from 3 to 6. Kansas City wins from 7 to 10, etc. The problem is that if you play more than one of them, you're reducing the overall odds, because one of those has to lose. So if you play multiple bets of that kind, the other is the needle in the haystack, which is kind of like who's going to be the MVP. For example, if you think Kansas City's defense is going to be very good and they're going to get 3 or 4 sacks, and you think Chris Jones is going to have a big game, maybe he wins at 100 to 1, the MVP odds. It's unlikely, but that's the kind of player that I would look for. But yeah, the index props, and they offer a lot. You can actually pick from like 0 to 60 the number of points that Kansas City will score in the game, and you get varying odds for each of those. I normally don't play those, although because this is one game, I tend to look more for the plus-priced odds, because the proposition itself is priced relatively correctly, but it's based upon a number of games. Here, you're either going to win or lose. You're not going to hit 52%, 58%, 47%.
So if there is a blowout, you guys think it would be San Francisco with the blowout?
I don't think it'll be a blowout at all.
Well, if there is.
I would, only because of the extent that San Francisco has an outstanding defense. In fact, one of the things, and I talked about it before, I don't look at yards per attempt for pass completions. It's meaningless because it includes incomplete passes. I look at yards per pass completion. That only takes a look at when passes are successfully completed. What do they average? The league average is 10 yards per completion. Both of these defenses allow under 10. They're two of about 5 or 6 teams that actually allow under 10 yards, which is almost a full yard below the league average. San Francisco on offense averages about 13 yards per completion. Kansas City just about 10 yards completion. So what I'm saying here is because you've got such good pass defenses, you're not going to expect that many big plays. So I would think that if there's a blowout, you look at Kansas City's decline in scoring all season and the fact that they're going up against one of the league's better defenses. San Francisco is more likely to be the team that, let's say, scores 34 to 40 points. At the same time, they also have the much weaker quarterback to lead that scoring onslaught.
All right, guys, we're down to about what we would call the 10-minute warning for our podcast. It's really gone by fast, to say the least, and we need to let everybody know out there what we will be doing in the Super Bowl, either from a side, total, or both standpoint. So, Greg, I'm going to pass it up to you first. Your Super Bowl pick.
Well, it's pretty easy for me. I'm going with the Chiefs. Again, Mahomes 10-4 straight up, 13-1 against the spread as a dog, including the Super Bowl last year, including both playoff games this year. I just think it's one of those things that's just too basic for me. Mahomes reminds me of Brady in the respect that even though I didn't pick the Chiefs, like once they win that first playoff game that impresses me, I roll with them. I did it last year. That's why I liked them against the Eagles. I'm doing it again this year. I can't bet against Patrick Mahomes. It's like, to me, it's like betting against Tom Brady.
Cool. Jim, I sort of kind of think I know what you're going to do. Maybe you can surprise us.
We put it in a video that Greg ran, so I think they already know. I've taken the points with Kansas City. I have the teaser with Kansas City and the under. I have all the props that I just told you about. I would say if there's a blowout, it's going to be because of turnovers, and I think the turnovers will probably come from the pressure of the Kansas City rush against Purdy, and he'll make some mistakes. That's what I would think. But like I said, this is one game. We're dissecting it like over and over and over again, and it's so hard to come up with a conclusion. In-game betting, I will do some things. You know, if I see something wrong or out of place, and something's going to make a change, if there's going to be an adjustment, I'm going to try to get on top of that.
Cool. Andy, what are you looking at for the Super Bowl this year?
In the newsletter, I do have a section summary of some key points. 3 in support of Kansas City, 3 in support of San Francisco, 3 against Kansas City, 3 against San Francisco. Support of Kansas City, Super Bowl experience, 4th trip in 5 seasons. Best defense since Mahomes has become the starter, and they've won 2 playoff games as an underdog on the road. That's pretty simple. The points against Kansas City, offense is weakest since Mahomes has been the starter in his 6 seasons, prone to turning over the football, tied for 3rd fewest second-half points scored per game this season. For San Francisco, best balanced team statistically and talent-wise in the NFL. Now, you can make an argument that talent-wise is an opinion. Statistically, those are numbers. Much the better offense this season of the two teams. The league average of rushing yards per game is 113 yards for the NFL. San Francisco exceeded that in 15 of their 19 games this year. So that's going to be a key that Baltimore did not do against Kansas City. The factors against San Francisco, they struggled in both home playoff games. Recent struggles against the Chiefs, the Super Bowl, and in their meeting in 2022. And they have a much weaker place kicker in Moody versus the veteran Butker. Having put that together with everything else, I will also admit, before the season began, one of the places, Circa in town, offered you the ability to bet on the exacta. Super Bowl winner tied to Super Bowl loser. I made several plays on that, 2 of which were Chiefs over 49ers and 49ers over Chiefs. So either way, I'm going to cash a ticket that pays in the low 30 to 1. It's a high number because you had to pick 2 teams you had to do before any regular teams were played. Now, in the newsletter, when I finally had to make a decision, my stronger opinion is on the under in the game. 2 very good defenses, a potent but still questionable San Francisco offense because of Purdy, and at the same time a Kansas City offense that's not as strong. I did go with San Francisco. It's so easy to make a case for Kansas City based upon the stats that most of you, especially Greg, cited with Mahomes' great record. They're the favorite. You could probably buy the. I've seen 1, 2.5 this week. It was at the Westgate since Sunday. Every place else is 2. It may come in, so you might be able to buy up to 3 somewhere. It looks a little bit too easy. Usually, when it looks too easy, it isn't. But there are times also when it looks too easy, and it really is. I don't know that it'll be easy in the sense that it'll be a blowout win, but the side that looks easy turns out to be the side. If I listen to a lot of the people, it's probably about 65-70% for picking the Chiefs. I just think this San Francisco 49er team has been an outstanding team when fully healthy. They're about as healthy as they've been basically all year. There's a defensive injury on Kansas City to one of their defensive linemen who I think it was an ACL or MCL. He broke in the Baltimore game that could have an impact on the pressure on Purdy. I've made the final score 23-16 San Francisco.
Andy, San Francisco under the play in the football game. Jim Feist, Kansas City. Greg DePalma, Kansas City. I'm going to cap it off also with the Kansas City Chiefs. And I'm going to maybe put a little whipped cream on the cake here. I had shared a little bit earlier on with you guys about in our database how teams perform in the Super Bowl when they come in off of a straight-up underdog win in a championship game, 19-7-1 to the spread. When opponents come in off of a win-no-cover, 2-8-1 to the spread. The combination of the two, when they collide like they're doing on this Super Bowl game this week, 5-0-1 to the team coming in off of the straight-up underdog win. That's Kansas City in this particular role. All the experience, the coaching, and everything else, they check too many boxes for me to ignore. I'd put a gun to my head if I watched Kansas City win the football game and didn't pronounce them.
And by the way, they also come in with the weaker record, which, as we've seen, also
is
extremely strong.
On top of all that. One quick note here, guys, before we sign off, our good friends at uwager.lv. All the props we talked about are available at uwager.lv. Log on, call 1-800-UWAGER. You can check out the size, the totals, the props, everything. It's a handicapping paradise at uwager.lv. I want to thank our co-host Greg DePalma from Prime Sports Network. Also, Andy Iskoe from TheLogicalApproach.com and our good buddy Jim Feist, the legend in Las Vegas, for all their great help on the show this week. And most of all, I want to thank you for joining us for the show. Be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Until next time, this is Marc Lawrence, reminding you to always remember to bet with your head, not over it, and good luck as always.